Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. In a quiet cell deep inside a federal prison in the desert, a heavy man with a thinning hairline once lay awake at night, staring at a cracked ceiling. The air was dry, the mattress thin, and the silence broken only by distant doors slamming and muffled shouts. That man had once worn a gold shield pinned proudly to his chest. He had shaken hands with commanders, posed for photographs, collected plaques, and basked in the praise of fellow officers who called him one of the toughest detectives in New York City. Now, he was known for something entirely different. Guards who walked past his door sometimes whispered his nickname under their breath. Reporters had branded him one of the mafia cops, a phrase that stuck like a stain that would never wash out. To some people, he was the ultimate traitor, a police officer who had crossed the line so far that he helped the very criminals he swore to stop. To others, he was a braggart who loved attention, who spent his whole life chasing respect, even if it meant taking the darkest possible path to get it. On certain nights, when the prison corridors grew still, he would replay his life in his head, scene by scene. The noisy Brooklyn block where he grew up, the voices of relatives who spoke low when they mentioned business, the first time he walked into a precinct house as a rookie, the first time he met a man who could open doors in the underworld with a single phone call. He knew how the story ended. Conviction, life sentences, a reputation destroyed. What bothered him, as the years rolled by, was how early the seeds had been planted, long before anyone called him by that terrible nickname. To understand how Louis Eppolito ended up in that cell, you have to go back to the beginning, to a boy on a Brooklyn street where crime and law walked side by side. He was born in Brooklyn in the summer of 1948, in a neighborhood where families sat on stoops, kids played stickball in the street, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's name. The air smelled of bread from small bakeries and tomato sauce drifting from kitchen windows. It was a place of tight bonds and tougher reputations. Behind the friendliness there was another layer. Quiet talk of guys from the neighborhood who commanded respect, men who dressed sharply, slipped into black cars, and were always treated with a mix of fear and admiration. In that world, the name Eppolito already meant something. Louis's father, Ralph, had a reputation beyond the block. Law enforcement believed he was involved with the Gambino crime family, one of the New York mafia groups that controlled rackets across the city. An uncle, too, was said to be a made man, someone who had taken an oath to that life. When relatives gathered in cramped apartments for birthdays or holidays, there were jokes, laughter, and hugs. But there were also sudden silences when certain topics came up. Children were sent out of the room. Adults lowered their voices. Business was business, and kids weren't supposed to ask questions. Young Louis watched and listened anyway. He saw the way people reacted when his father walked down the street. Older women on the block greeted him warmly. Men nodded with a hint of caution. No one pushed him around. Authority, in that corner of Brooklyn, didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wore a suit, a pinky ring, and a quiet smile that hid something more dangerous. At home, Louis struggled with his own sense of who he was. He was a big child, heavy-set from a young age, and other kids teased him. He wanted to be strong, respected, somebody others looked up to. He loved movies about tough guys and heroes, but he didn't always decide who those heroes were. In one moment, he admired police officers who chased robbers in black and white TV shows. In the next, he admired uncles and neighbors who seemed to move through the world without fear, even though whispers linked them to organized crime. School didn't offer him much comfort. Teachers sometimes saw him as loud, a bit of a clown, more interested in impressing classmates than doing assignments. He wasn't stupid. He simply didn't feel drawn to books. He was drawn to attention. The more people laughed at his jokes or admired his size, the better he felt. Deep down, though, he nursed insecurities that never really went away. Outside, Brooklyn in the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds was changing. The old neighborhood still had their social clubs where older men gathered at night, but now there were also cops who drove slowly past, watching, writing down license plates. The police and the mob shared the same streets, sometimes the same diners, sometimes the same funerals. Louis grew up watching that quiet dance. Officers who knew who the mob guys were. Mob guys who knew which officers could be pushed, which ones couldn't. He saw both sides, and each side fascinated him. In his teens, he started hearing more openly about his family's reputation. People told him his father had status. Some said it as a compliment. Others said it as a warning. Inside Louis, a conflict grew. On the one hand, he wanted to impress his father, to show he wasn't weak. On the other hand, he also began to dream of proving he could stand on his own, not just as a mobster's son, but as something completely different. Law enforcement, in a strange way, seemed like that path. Being a cop promised a badge, a gun, a steady paycheck, but also something that had always called to him: respect. If he made it as a police officer, he could walk into any bar in the city and be recognized as a man of authority. People would have to listen to him. So, despite the irony of it, the son and nephew of mob figures set his sights on the academy. When he finally went down to take the police entrance exam, he carried all that history with him. To the people handing out forms, he was just another young man looking for a job. To himself, he was about to step into a life that could either distance him from his family's underworld connections or bring him right back to them. The late 1960 seconds were a turbulent time in New York. Protests, rising crime, the smell of change in the air. When Louis entered the police academy around that period, he found something that fit him better than school ever had. There were uniforms, drills, commands shouted in echoing halls. There was a sense of belonging he had never felt before. He discovered he had a talent for the physical side of the job. He was big, he was strong, and he liked the feeling of power when he strapped on a gun belt and looked at himself in the mirror. Some instructors saw potential in him. They noticed his size, his willingness to take charge, his eagerness to be seen as tough. At the same time, others noticed his hunger for attention. He seemed to enjoy telling stories, hyping up his own exploits even before he had any real ones. It was as if he had already started to build a legend in his own mind, the brave Brooklyn cop from a rough background who wasn't afraid of anything. After graduation, he was assigned to patrol. The city he stepped into as a young officer was rougher than anything on television. Streets were filled with petty thieves, drug dealers, angry arguments that could turn violent without warning. Louis thrived in that environment. He liked the chase, the adrenaline, the feeling that every night brought a new test of his strength and courage. Arrests brought commendations. Commendations brought notice from higher-ups. His size and swagger made him stand out in every precinct he entered. Some colleagues liked him immediately. Others kept their distance, sensing he could be a little too eager to prove himself. But in the official record, his early years showed many arrests and honors. He was the kind of officer who wanted to be known as fearless, the guy who would run toward trouble while others hesitated. Still, the old neighborhood was never far away. Family dinners, weddings, and funerals brought him back to the same Brooklyn streets where he had grown up. There, the lines between his new career and his childhood ties blurred. At a party, he'd be in the corner with cousins and older men whose names appeared in police files. They would slap his back, call him Louis, and ask about life on the job. He would joke that now he was the one with the gun and the badge, then wave off their laughs. For many officers, being seen with known mafia figures would have been unthinkable. For Louis, it felt natural. Those were his relatives, his roots. He didn't see himself as doing anything wrong just by standing in a social club or attending a memorial service. In his mind, he was still loyal to his family and to the department. He convinced himself he could walk that tightrope forever. The problem was that others were watching. Inside the NYPD, specialized units kept track of organized crime families and their associates. Informants whispered names. Surveillance photos captured faces at club doorways. At some point in the early 1980 seconds, Louis's name began to appear in reports, not only as a detective, but as someone who seemed unusually close to certain Gambino-connected figures. Rumors began to spread in quiet corners of the department. Some officers asked how a detective with well-known mob relatives could spend time around those circles and never cross a line. Others started to suspect that maybe he had crossed one already. Still, rumor is not proof, and Louis seemed to enjoy the renaty tension. He liked to portray himself as the tough cop who had grown up around mobsters but never belonged to them. He used that background to build his own legend, telling stories that made him look both dangerous and untouchable. His ambition never slept. He wanted more than just to be another uniform on a beat. He pushed to move into detective work, into specialized units that chased bigger fish, drug traffickers, hitmen, high-level mob figures. Eventually, he made detective and achieved something he had dreamed of. He was part of the world that hunted the very crime families whose names had echoed through his childhood. On paper, it looked like a remarkable rise. The overweight Brooklyn kid from a notorious clan had become a decorated detective assigned to units that targeted organized crime. He collected medals, citations, and praise. At one point, the department honored him for his record, and newspapers ran pieces painting him as a symbol of how someone could escape a mob heritage and serve the law. Behind that public image, however, another story was already unfolding. The first major sign came when he was formally accused of leaking information. In the mid-1980s, prosecutors and internal investigators brought a case against him, alleging he had passed confidential police files to a man tied to the Gambino family. According to those charges, he had looked up sensitive data and shared it, effectively giving a helping hand to people under investigation. If proven, that would have meant he had already begun to use his position not to fight the mob, but to help it. He fought the charges hard, insisting he was innocent. He said he had been targeted because of his family name, because people assumed that anyone with his background must be dirty. In a departmental trial and in court, he portrayed himself as the loyal cop from a mob household who had chosen the opposite path. In the end, he was acquitted. The case fell apart enough that he walked away, keeping his badge, his salary, and his rising status. To outsiders, that might have looked like vindication. He even turned the episode into part of his story, claiming it showed how he had been unfairly suspected. Years later, he put out a memoir, presenting himself as a dedicated officer who had survived growing up surrounded by organized crime without giving into it. The title highlighted that contrast, offering him to the public as a spectacular example of a man who had learned from his family's mistakes and done the right thing. Inside policing circles and among federal investigators, though, doubts lingered. Some believed the accusations had been true, even if they hadn't been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Some thought he had simply been lucky, that the witnesses against him had been too shaky. For those people, the acquittal didn't end suspicion. It deepened it. Meanwhile, Louis continued with his detective work. He moved into elite squads dealing with narcotics and organized crime, where secrets were more valuable and temptations were greater. In those units, detectives had access to sealed files, sources, and information about ongoing cases that mob families were desperate to know. A single leak could mean the difference between a successful indictment and a failed one, or even life and death for informants on the street. Louis liked this environment. He liked being near the center of important investigations. He liked visiting crime scenes, interviewing witnesses, moving among ranking officers, while younger cops watched with a mixture of admiration and envy. He had made it. He was a big man in every sense, in size, in reputation, in ego. His choice of friends and associates, however, remained questionable. He still socialized with figures from his old neighborhood who had deep ties to organized crime. Some gatherings were explained away as family events, where he couldn't help who his cousins or uncles were. Yet, as time went on, lines blurred. A favor here, an introduction there, a conversation behind closed doors, each small step seemed harmless in the moment. He still put on the same detective shield every morning. He still swore he served the law. But bit by bit, a pattern was forming, one that only became clear when investigators later traced it backward. A life that had begun with a choice between two worlds was drawing those worlds together. Inside the detective squads where he worked, there were other officers who, like him, had grown up around tough neighborhoods and complicated loyalties. Among them, he found one partner in particular whose path would become entangled with his own in a way that would shock the country years later. By the time Louis reached his early 40s, he had spent decades on the force. He had a home life, a wife, children, and the comfort that came with a steady paycheck and overtime. He also had something else, a sense that he deserved more, that the praise he had already received didn't match the grand story he held in his mind about himself. The combination of pride, resentment, and long-standing underworld connections laid the ground for choices that would take him beyond simple rule-breaking, beyond casual contact with old friends, into a far darker role. On long nights during his later years in that desert prison, as he gazed upward and listened to the distant sounds of steel doors and murmured voices, those earlier years in Brooklyn must have replayed endlessly. The kid on the stoop, the teenager staring at older men in suits, the rookie cop thrilled by the weight of a gun on his hip. Step by step, he had walked a road that led to that cell, even if, at the time, he told himself he could balance both worlds forever. Years later, in courtrooms and news stories, people kept returning to one simple image: a corner booth in a Brooklyn diner, late at night. A big detective in plain clothes slid into the seat, ordered coffee, and waited. Across from him sat a careful man who was not a cop, not exactly a gangster either, but something in between. The two spoke quietly, leaning close so no one could hear. When the conversation ended, an envelope changed hands under the table. The detective stood, adjusted his belt, and walked back out into the city he was sworn to protect. That picture didn't appear out of nowhere. It came from a long line of choices that started years earlier, when Louis Eppolito was becoming one of the best-known detectives in Brooklyn. By the early 1982, he had made a name for himself on the force. He had left the basic patrol shifts behind and moved into detective work. Robberies, shootings, narcotics cases, he handled them all with a loud, forceful style that fit his size. To many colleagues, he seemed fearless. Suspects often remembered the heavy-set investigator with the booming voice and thick Brooklyn accent who pressed them hard in interview rooms. He liked to come across as the toughest man in the building. Supervisors liked results, and he delivered arrests. Commendations piled up. Internal paperwork showed a growing list of awards. People in his squad room said he had a nose for the street and connections that helped him get information quickly. In a city where crime numbers were climbing, that ability made him valuable. But those connections had another side. Some of the people who answered his calls or whispered in his ear had links to the same underworld from which his relatives came. Louis didn't always see a problem in that. New York policing had long relied on informants who were themselves involved in wrongdoing. To him, knowing those circles was part of the job. What he never admitted, at least not publicly, was how much those circles pulled at him personally. In the early 1980s, his name suddenly left the quiet world of internal gossip and appeared in official papers in a way no officer wanted. Investigators in Brooklyn accused him of taking a confidential police intelligence report, one that described organized crime figures and an informant who was helping authorities and passing it to a member of the Gambino family. The report was found during a raid on a suspected mob figure. His fingerprints were on it. To prosecutors, that seemed clear. A detective with mob relatives had reached into restricted files and handed a sensitive document to the very people it was supposed to help bring down. That kind of leak could put lives in danger and ruin long investigations. They brought a criminal case against him. Newspapers mentioned his family background and suggested he might be a double-crosser inside the department. Louis reacted with outrage. He admitted he had seen the file while working in an intelligence unit, but he insisted that was normal. He said he had never passed the paper to anyone outside the department. If his prints were on it, he argued, that only proved he had handled it at work. In court, his lawyer attacked the reliability of witnesses and questioned whether the chain of custody for the report had been secure. The trial became something more than just a narrow question about a single document. It turned into a kind of test of his entire life story. Was he an honest cop unfairly suspected because of his last name? Or a man who had quietly chosen his family's side? In the end, the jury wasn't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. He was acquitted. The department's internal case against him also collapsed. Officially, he was cleared. He kept his badge, his rank, and his pension track. For many officers, simply being put on trial would have been humiliating enough to drive them into a quiet, low-profile career or even out of law enforcement. Louis did the opposite. He turned the near disaster into part of his personal legend. He told people the case showed how prejudice against his background had almost ruined him. He claimed he had beaten the charges because he was innocent and strong enough to stand up to a system that had tried to frame him. He didn't stop there. He began to lean into his strange position as a cop from a mob-connected family. He spoke openly and sometimes theatrically, about his relatives. He described himself as a man who had grown up surrounded by crime, but had chosen instead to serve the law. That contrast made for good stories, and Louis loved telling stories. As the decade moved on, he gathered more praise. He ended up in a Brooklyn detective squad that handled heavy work in a neighborhood thick with Italian-American families, including people tied to the major crime families. His arrest record remained strong. Colleagues recognized him with local awards. A national law enforcement publication highlighted him. Within the department, he became known as a colorful, sometimes controversial, yet undeniably productive detective. All the while, rumors followed him. Some officers whispered that he was too close to certain figures. Others shrugged and said that in some precincts, everyone knew someone. No one had proof of anything beyond the old beaten case about the leaked file. He stayed careful just enough to avoid fresh formal trouble. Then, in a move that stunned some who had doubted him, he wrote a book. In the early 1990 seconds, he published an autobiography with a title that played off the tension in his life. On its pages, he painted himself as a rough-edged, street-smart New York detective who had walked a tightrope between law and organized crime since childhood, but had remained loyal to the badge. The book told stories about mob figures and dangerous arrests. He described the earlier accusations about leaked documents and portrayed himself as the victim of a witch hunt. The book gained attention. Television shows invited him to talk. He appeared on national programs, booming voice and all, telling millions of viewers how he had come out of a mob household and become one of the city's most decorated officers. He made himself into something like a character from a movie. The big, brash Brooklyn detective who knew the underworld, but was not owned by it. That public image helped him. It also hid something else that, by then, was already going on behind the scenes. Around the mid-1980 seconds, he had grown close to another NYPD detective, Stephen Caracappa. Where Louis was loud and heavy, Caracappa was lean and quiet. He worked in a sensitive organized crime unit that had access to high-level intelligence on mafia families. Together, the two men looked almost like a mismatched pair. One a showman, the other reserved. But they shared a background in tough neighborhoods, long careers, and a willingness to move in and out of gray areas. Caracappa had his own contacts in the underworld. One of them was Burton Kaplan, a businessman who secretly dealt in large-scale drug trafficking and was close to Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family. Casso was one of the most feared mob leaders in New York at the time, a man responsible for many acts of violence and known for his suspicion and ruthlessness. For him, having access to inside information from the police would be priceless. Through Kaplan, an offer took shape. If detectives could quietly supply sensitive data, home addresses, license plates, details on investigations, Casso would pay very well. At first, the idea focused only on information. No direct action, just access. Law enforcement computers had records on virtually every person Casso viewed as a threat or rival. A detective with the right codes could pull up those records in seconds. According to later court testimony, this is where Louis crossed a boundary that he could never walk back. Along with Caracappa, he began feeding information, through Kaplan, to Casso. They were paid in cash, thousands of dollars at a time. It started, prosecutors said, with simple lookups. A name entered into a computer would yield an address and other details. That information would pass through Kaplan to Casso. In a city as complex as New York, it wasn't immediately obvious to anyone outside those involved that this was happening. Data moved quietly. Targets rarely knew how their enemies had learned where they lived or which car they drove. Inside the department, Louis still wore his shield, still collected a paycheck, still investigated street crimes like any other detective. But within the world of organized crime, he and Caracappa had become something different, paid insiders. Casso later claimed he called them his crystal ball, because they could look into police records and tell him what law enforcement knew about him and his rivals. Money spoke loudly. The cash flowing from Kaplan and Casso made a significant difference in the detectives' lives. Official salaries were good, but not enough to justify certain luxuries. Extra envelopes filled that gap. Once they had accepted those first payments, saying no became harder each time. Every new favor created new leverage. Casso now had crooked officers on his payroll and could threaten to expose them if they ever turned on him. The work soon moved from simple information leaks to much darker services. One example involved a Lucchese member named Anthony Delapi. He had fallen out with leadership and moved across the country, hoping distance and anonymity would keep him safe. Casso wanted him eliminated. A federal jury would later hear that Caracappa and Louis used their access to track Delapi down. They dug through records, found his new life in California, and passed that location to Casso's people. In early 1990, Delapi was ambushed and killed in Los Angeles. The detectives did not pull the trigger, but prosecutors argued that without their help, the killers might never have found him. Another case began with a young man named James Jimmy Heidel, who had been involved in violent crimes and had enemies. Casso believed Heidel had tried to harm him. According to later testimony, Louis and his partner used the power of their badges to grab Heidel off the street. They pulled him over, removed him from his car, and turned him over to men loyal to Casso. What happened afterward was left unspoken in court in detail, but Heidel was never seen alive again. The detectives went back to work as if nothing had happened. Perhaps the most haunting episode involved a mistaken identity. Casso wanted to know who within his own organization had cooperated with authorities against him. He was told a name, Nicholas Guido. The detectives, jurors later heard, used their computer access to look up that name. They found a man in Brooklyn with that exact name and obtained his address and car information. They passed that along. The problem was that the Nicholas Guido in the computer system, the one they had found, was not the mob informant at all. He was an innocent young man who shared the same name. On Christmas Day 1986, as he sat in a parked car after a holiday gathering, gunmen executed him. He died because Casso believed he was a traitor, and because two detectives working for the city had fed the wrong name and address to a violent underboss. Each of these acts chipped away at whatever line still separated Louis from the criminals he had grown up around. He had started as a boy watching powerful men on his Brooklyn block, unsure which model to follow. Now, in middle age, he had become a bridge between the uniformed world and the underworld, moving information and people across that bridge for cash. Meanwhile, publicly, he still wore the mask of a loyal lawman. He gave interviews promoting his book. He took part in television segments about policing and organized crime, presenting himself as an expert on both. In the precinct, younger officers saw only the surface. The older detective with war stories and commendation ribbons. They didn't see late-night meetings in parked cars or quiet trips to hand over addresses to a criminal go-between. The double life required constant juggling. He had to respond to legitimate cases while also keeping an eye on investigations that might brush up against Casso or Kaplan. If a task force formed to target a certain crew, he had to know whether that crew touched the Lucchese circle he secretly served. His insider status let him warn Casso when raids or wiretaps approached too close. That constant balancing act brought with it a sense of risk, but also a thrill. For a man who had always craved importance, being at the center of both law enforcement and organized crime may have felt like the highest form of power. He was a gatekeeper. He decided which secrets flowed and which stayed locked away. Yet every envelope of cash, every whispered meeting, every name he ran through a computer for reasons that had nothing to do with official duty, tied him more tightly to men who did not forgive mistakes. At home, with his family, he could pretend he was just a hard-working New York detective. On television, he could call himself a hero. But in that Brooklyn, diner, in parked cars, on dimly lit streets where favors were traded in hushed tones, he had stepped far over a boundary that had once been clear. The road that had begun with a child watching mobsters and cops from the same stoop had now led him into a place where he was both at once and, in the eyes of the law he had sworn to uphold, something far worse. On certain evenings in the late 1980s, the city lights flickered off the windshield of a parked car while two men sat inside in silence. One was the quiet detective from the organized crime unit, the other the big, loud Brooklyn cop who loved to talk. Between them lay a plain envelope, fat with cash. Neither man looked at it right away. They spoke about families, about weather, about routine cases. Only when the small talk ended did one of them slide the envelope across the seat, and the other slip it into his jacket like it was nothing more than a stack of forms. That was how the arrangement with Anthony Gaspipe Casso worked. It wasn't dramatic. No signed contracts, no grand meetings in smoky back rooms. Just small circles of trust, regular payoffs, and a dangerous understanding. Through Burton Kaplan, the go-between who knew both the detectives and the Lucchese underboss, a deal had been set. For a set monthly amount, plus extra rewards when certain favors were done, Louis and his partner would provide something Casso craved: information from inside the New York City Police Department, home addresses, vehicle registrations, details about ongoing investigations, sometimes even the whereabouts of people who believed they had disappeared. The monthly payment, according to later testimony, was several $1,000s. On top of that, there were special bonuses when a particular job mattered more. For two city employees used to a regular government salary, those extra stacks of bills changed the math of everyday life. It meant nicer restaurants, better clothes, more comfort. It also meant they now belonged to someone who settled disputes with violence. At first, Louis seemed to treat the arrangement like just another hustle. In the world he had grown up in, people did favors. Someone needed a license plate checked? If they were an old friend, you looked it up. Someone wanted to know who lived at a certain address? You helped. Then maybe they helped you down the road. That kind of thinking had always floated around the edge of some precincts, even among people who would never dream of going as far as he eventually did. The difference now was scale and intent. These weren't vague questions from random acquaintances. Casso was asking for specific targets, often men who had crossed him or who might be thinking about cooperating with law enforcement. As the underboss of a major family, he already had his own network. What he didn't have, until the detectives came along, was a direct tap into official government records. The mechanics were simple. A name would be passed through Kaplan. The detectives would go back to their offices, log into law enforcement databases, and search. Sometimes they used their own passwords. Other times they borrowed someone else's. Records that were supposed to be locked inside the system appeared on their computer screens: addresses, vehicle information, even notes about ongoing cases. They wrote down what they found or memorized enough to pass on. Then it went back to Kaplan, and from him to Casso. Everyone in that chain understood why the information was being gathered. When Casso asked where someone lived, it wasn't so he could send a birthday card. One of the earliest and most chilling episodes involved James "Jimmy" Heidel, a young man from Brooklyn who had tangled with the wrong people. Casso believed Heidel had been involved in an attempt on his life. In Casso's world, that meant Heidel was marked. To reach him, though, Casso needed more than just rumors. He needed a way to get his hands on him without attracting attention. According to later court evidence, that was where the detectives came in. Using their badges, they intercepted Heidel after he left his home. They took him into their custody under the color of authority, but instead of driving him to a station, they delivered him to men loyal to Casso. Heidel vanished. His family never got answers. On paper, there was no official arrest. Inside certain circles, though, people understood that two sworn officers had been the ones to remove him from the street. Then there was the case of Anthony DeLappy. He had once been part of the Lucchese family but had fallen out with leadership. Sensing danger, he moved from New York to Los Angeles and tried to build a life far from the boroughs that had shaped him. He probably thought the distance and anonymity of the West Coast would keep him beyond reach. Casso, angry and determined, wasn't willing to let him go. He turned to Kaplan, who turned to the detectives. DeLappy was no longer easy to spot. He didn't hang around familiar clubs in Brooklyn or Manhattan, but the government kept track of people in other ways. Employment records, driver's licenses, official filings, all of that could be traced by someone who knew how to dig. Investigators later told jurors that the detectives used their access to law enforcement tools to track DeLappy's trail to California. They learned where he was living, what car he drove, enough for Casso's associates to locate him. In early 1990, DeLappy was attacked and killed in Los Angeles. The actual attackers were West Coast shooters. The people who had supplied the key information that made the hit possible, prosecutors said, were sitting thousands of miles away behind NYPD desks. Even more tragic was what happened with the wrong man named Nicholas Guido. Casso was hunting someone inside his own circle who, he believed, had talked to authorities. He was told the informant's name was Nick Guido. It was a common enough name in parts of Brooklyn. Without careful checking, confusion was almost guaranteed. When Casso wanted to find this supposed traitor, He again turned to his law enforcement pipeline. The detectives typed Nicholas Guido into their computer system. A listing popped up. A young man who fit the name, living in Brooklyn, driving a certain car. That listing belonged to an entirely innocent person, a young mechanic with no secret ties to the Lucchese family. Prosecutors later said that the detectives passed this address and vehicle description onward. Casso's team took that data as confirmation, never realizing it pointed to the wrong man. On Christmas Day, as the young mechanic sat in his car after a family gathering, gunmen struck. He died in a burst of gunfire. His relatives left to mourn a loss they could not understand. The real mob informant, who had inspired Casso's search in the first place, was alive somewhere else under the same name. The pattern repeated itself in other cases, each time blending police access with criminal aims. When Casso wanted to remove someone he suspected of disloyalty, the detectives could check if that person had spoken with investigators or appeared in sealed documents. If they had, they moved higher on Casso's list. When Casso wanted to weaken rival families, the detectives could pass license plates and addresses of Gambino figures, making it easier for ambushes to be planned. One often discussed killing involved a Gambino leader named Edward Lino. Federal prosecutors later argued that on a night in 1990, the detectives conducted what looked like a routine traffic stop on Lino's car on a New York highway. Moments later, gunmen arrived and opened fire. The stop had placed the target exactly where his attackers needed him to be. To passing drivers, it appeared to be just another late-night incident. To investigators who later pieced events together, it looked like a deadly trap set with the help of police. In another episode, the detectives were accused of helping locate a Lucchese captain named Peter Chiodo at a time when Casso no longer trusted him. By checking official records, they confirmed Chiodo's home address and even where his relatives stayed. Chiodo was ambushed and wounded. He survived and eventually chose to cooperate with the government, becoming one of the many voices that, years later, described how Casso had used corrupt officers as tools. Yet for much of that period, none of these links were clearly visible to the outside world. Within the NYPD, Louis continued to work cases like any other veteran detective. He showed up in squad rooms, signed reports, drove to crime scenes, and argued with prosecutors about evidence. He laughed loudly in hallways, told jokes, and complained about management like everyone else. At the same time, he kept feeding his appetite for attention. The autobiography he had published gave him a taste of media spotlight. In the early 1990 seconds, he even landed small acting roles, often as background characters in crime films. In one famous example, he appeared briefly in the movie Goodfellas, playing a minor mob figure. On screen, he looked entirely at home as part of a fictional underworld, while off-screen he still carried a real detective shield and quietly helped real mobsters. Those who knew him socially noticed that he spoke constantly about his own exploits. He told stories about dangerous arrests, about confrontations with violent suspects, about surviving the earlier leak accusation. Some of the stories grew larger each time he told them. He wanted to be seen as a legend. The truth that his most significant secret work was being done in the shadows for a crime family never came up in those loud retellings. Inside himself, he seemed to have found a way to justify what he was doing. He told some people later that everyone in his world bent rules in some fashion, that the line between good and bad was not as sharp as outsiders believed. He claimed that men like Casso were simply part of the environment, and that working with them was no different, morally, from using them as informants. Whether he believed that or simply said it to feel better about his choices is impossible to know for certain. What is clear is that he refused, for years, to view himself as corrupt. Meanwhile, federal agents and honest detectives were steadily building cases against Casso and other high-ranking members of the Lucchese organization. Wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperation from insiders all added small pieces to large files. Faces were matched to voices, cars to license plates, meeting spots to names, reports stacked up on desks with details of who met whom and when. Yet the idea that veteran police officers were secretly working for Casso remained, at that time, unimaginable to most investigators. Corruption had appeared in the department before, of course. There had been bruising scandals in earlier decades involving payoffs and shakedowns. But the notion that experienced detectives would go so far as to assist in locating people for violent attacks seemed beyond the usual pattern. When informants muttered vague claims about cops on the payroll, many agents and prosecutors assumed they were exaggerating to gain favor. That disbelief gave Louis and his partner time. Time to take more cash. Time to run more names. Time to sit in more cars on dark streets. Listening to Kaplan talk about what Casso needed next. Each new favor tightened the knot around them, even if they couldn't yet feel the rope. Back at home, Louis tried to maintain the role of family man. Neighbors saw a middle-aged detective who went to work, came back, and spent evenings with his wife and children. He was proud of his kids, proud of the house he could afford. He talked about retirement plans, about maybe moving somewhere warmer, about writing more or working on films. To those around him, he looked like an officer who had climbed from a rough beginning to a comfortable middle age. In truth, those dreams of a future away from New York were not just the fantasies of a man thinking about the next stage of his life. They were also an escape route forming in the back of his mind. He knew that Casso's world was unstable. One arrest, one wiretap, one betrayal could bring the entire arrangement into the open. If that ever happened, he would need distance and a new setting, somewhere far from the corridors where he had spent decades as both detective and secret asset. But for the moment, as the 1,980 seconds gave way to the early 1,990 seconds, the double existence held. On one side stood Detective Louis Eppolito, big personality, decorated officer, author, on-screen extra. On the other stood the man who quietly sold information, steered targets toward danger, and let his knowledge of police systems serve a crime family. The two roles lived in the same body, walked the same streets, carried the same badge. It could not last forever. The world he was serving underground was about to crack open, and with it would come voices that, once ignored, would finally be heard. Anthony Gaspipe. Casso liked to boast that he could smell danger long before others did, but even he couldn't outrun it forever. By the early 1,990 seconds, pressure from federal agents and rival mobsters closed in around him. His phones were tapped, his partners were flipping, and bodies connected to his wars kept bringing more attention. For a time he ducked underground, hiding in quiet houses far from the Brooklyn streets that had made him powerful. In 1993, agents tracked him to a home in New Jersey and moved in. The underboss who had ordered so many attacks was suddenly in handcuffs, sitting in an interview room, staring at people he had long considered enemies. Casso made a fast calculation. If he stayed silent, he faced a lifetime behind bars with no chance of release. If he talked, maybe he could shave his sentence, maybe even someday see daylight again. He chose to cooperate. It was a stunning decision, one of New York's most feared mob leaders agreeing to sit down with prosecutors and lay out what he knew. He had plenty to say. He talked about rival bosses, hidden rackets, stashed cash, buried weapons. He named dozens of people and described inner workings of the Lucchese organization. Then he said something that stopped some listeners cold. He told them he had 2 New York City detectives on his personal payroll. He had a nickname for them, one that would later appear in headlines. My cops. He described one as a quiet investigator from an elite organized crime unit, the other as a big, loud Brooklyn detective who liked attention. He claimed he paid each of them thousands of dollars every month to supply information, track down targets, and even arrange ambushes. Names followed: Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito. To some in the room, the claims sounded almost too extreme to be real. Corrupt officers weren't unheard of. History held plenty of examples of officers who took envelopes to ignore gambling or protect small-time dealers. But detectives helping a mafia underboss identify informants and track down rivals for lethal attacks? That crossed a line few could imagine. Prosecutors wrote everything down anyway. Casso, they knew, had motives. He wanted to impress them with the volume of his information. The more sensational his stories, the more valuable he seemed, at least in his mind. Still, what he was describing wasn't a vague rumor. He gave details, meeting spots, cash payments, specific cases where the detectives' help had allegedly led to violent outcomes. On paper, those details were chilling. In practice, using them in court would require something more: corroboration. Casso already had a reputation for dishonesty inside his own world. He had encouraged attacks, then lied about his role. He had turned on friends. Federal agents discovered that even after agreeing to cooperate, he tried to manipulate his conditions. passing messages and acting as if he still commanded an outside network. When he violated the rules, authorities revoked his cooperation deal. He lost the chance at a reduced sentence. With his credibility damaged, his claims about 2 detectives went into a file marked as intriguing but unproven. Investigators didn't forget them, but they couldn't stand in court on Casso's word alone. Around the same time, other high-ranking Lucchese members chose cooperation, including former acting boss Alphonse Little Al Darko and wounded Captain Peter Chiodo. They too mentioned hearing that certain detectives were too close to Casso. Darko recalled that people in the organization whispered about an NYPD insider. Chiodo, after surviving an attack, spoke about how his relatives' addresses had somehow become known to the very people trying to silence him. Those accounts lined up in a broad way with what Casso had said. But they were still second-hand, more impressions than hard proof. None of the witnesses had personally handed money to the detectives or sat in on every meeting. Investigators were left with a disturbing picture, and no clean way to frame it as a prosecutable case. While those conversations took place in secure rooms in federal offices, Louis had already begun reshaping his public image yet again. In the early 1990 seconds, after more than 2 decades on the job, his NYPD career wound down. He left with a pension, a detective's record full of citations, and a trail of internal suspicions that had never turned into formal discipline beyond the old leak case he'd beaten. For the outside world, his departure looked like that of many long-serving officers, a man from a tough generation stepping away after years of hard work. He didn't disappear quietly, though. His autobiography hit shelves in 1992, titled in a way that underlined his whole narrative, a tough cop who grew up in a mob family but stayed true to his badge. In its pages, he described bringing in dangerous suspects, working brutal hours, and navigating the tension between his relative's reputation and his chosen profession. He again cast the earlier accusation about the leaked report as a smear campaign, insisting he had been a loyal detective unfairly hounded because of his last name. The book reached readers beyond New York. Some took it at face value, seeing in it a gritty story of a man who had risen above his environment. Others, especially those inside law enforcement, read it with a more skeptical eye, noting what he chose to highlight and what he left vague or avoided. That same period brought fresh trouble. In the early 1990 seconds, he was charged in a federal case accusing him of involvement in a narcotics scheme. It was a serious allegation. Prosecutors claimed he had used his connections to assist a large-scale drug operation. Once again, he pleaded not guilty. Once again, a jury found him not guilty. He walked out of court free, telling reporters that he had been targeted unfairly because people couldn't accept the idea of a man with his background being honest. 2 major trials, 2 acquittals. To his supporters, that meant vindication. To some investigators, it felt like watching a skilled operator slip through fingers again and again. Hollywood, meanwhile, continued to pull at him. His small role in Goodfellas, filmed while he was still a detective, had whetted his appetite for acting. After retirement, he chased more parts. Casting directors needed authentic-looking tough guys for police dramas and mafia stories. Louis fit neatly into that demand. He appeared in minor roles, did background work, and began pitching stories of his own, hoping to see his life or his ideas turned into full-length films. New York's early 1990 seconds were full of talk about police corruption in general. The Mullen Commission, a high-profile inquiry, exposed serious misconduct in some units. Officers stealing from drug dealers, shaking down residents, abusing their authority. The public heard about dirty cops in headlines and evening news segments. But those scandals focused mostly on narcotics squads and street-level crimes, not the alleged deep-seated cooperation with organized crime that Casso had hinted at. The idea that someone like Louis, decorated, celebrated in print and on television, might have taken part in far worse conduct than simple bribery, seemed too extreme for many to accept. He had a ready answer whenever his name came up in connection with his family history. He had broken away, he said, and anyone who claimed otherwise was jealous or misinformed. Then he left the city entirely. In the mid-1990 seconds, he and his wife moved west to Las Vegas, the desert city built on bright lights and long odds. It was, in some ways, a natural destination. The old mob influence still echoed through the casinos and neighborhoods, even as corporate owners replaced many of the earlier figures. Film productions came through regularly, using the city's unique look and legend. For a retired detective who wanted to act and write, Las Vegas offered both distance from New York and opportunity. He bought a comfortable house in a quiet subdivision. Neighbors saw a heavyset man with a friendly manner, who said he used to be a New York cop and had appeared in movies. He talked about scripts he was writing, projects in development, plans for crime dramas that would draw on his experiences. He opened or invested in small businesses, including ventures linked to film and video. His official income included his NYPD pension and whatever he earned from side work. Old habits and old friendships did not completely vanish with the move. Other retired officers drifted west, including his former partner Caracappa, who settled not far away. They remained close, meeting for meals or to talk about property investments and future plans. At the same time, Las Vegas had its own circle of people with East Coast ties and long memories. A retired New York detective who had written about growing up in a mob family and working organized crime cases found an eager audience in certain restaurants and back rooms. Back in New York, the trail of the mafia cop story never vanished completely. A few stubborn investigators, both in the NYPD and at the federal level, held on to the scraps. Casso's claims, Darko's hints, Chiodo's fears about how his family had been located. They compared case files from old unsolved killings, looking for patterns, victims connected to Casso, police stops before attacks, sudden appearances by unknown cars moments before shots were fired. Some names kept coming back: Heidel, Dillapi, Lino, the wrong Nicholas Guido. The same mob underboss's anger seemed to sit somewhere behind each episode, and in the background, the same two detectives appeared repeatedly in reports about Lucchese activity, at least on paper, since their official assignments had placed them near that world. The problem remained the same. There was no one at the center willing to testify who had actually arranged the payments and requests. Casso was too compromised to rely on alone. Others had only indirect knowledge, the kind of case that could strip a former detective and his partner of their badges, even years after retirement, needed more than suspicion and overlapping stories. It needed someone who had been in the room when envelopes changed hands, that someone was sitting in federal prison. Burton Kaplan, the jeweler-turned-trafficker who had linked the detectives to Casso, had been arrested in the mid-1990s on a major narcotics case of his own. Investigators found that he had overseen large shipments of contraband and laundered money through various businesses. In 1997, he was convicted and handed a long sentence. He was in his 60 seconds, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. When prosecutors first approached him, they wanted to know about Casso, about drug routes, about hidden assets. Kaplan admitted some things but refused to discuss his relationship with the two detectives. In his world, betraying corrupt law enforcement officers could be considered even more dangerous than talking about mob captains. He kept that part of his story locked away, even as he watched years disappear behind fences and walls. For a time, it looked as if the truth about Louis' double life might remain buried with the aging men who knew about it. Casso was locked into a sentence that would keep him in federal custody for life. Kaplan stayed silent. The detectives had retired and moved across the country. Files sat in boxes, occasionally opened, often set aside again for more immediate cases. Meanwhile, Louis carried on in Las Vegas as if he had outlived all risk. He went to restaurants, attended local premieres, appeared at small events as the former mafia cop who wrote a book about choosing the right side. He pitched projects that cast him as an expert on both policing and organized crime. To those who met him there, he seemed like a larger-than-life New York character, enjoying a second act in the desert. Yet the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected. In quiet prison corridors far away, Kaplan grew older and began to reconsider what he owed to others and to himself. Federal agents, undeterred by years of delay, kept circling back to the same name. The retired detective in Las Vegas, whose life story never quite matched the shadows around it. The double existence Louis had carefully maintained, heroic cop in his own telling, suspected traitor in hidden files, was about to collide with a new wave of evidence. For years, he had believed that geography and time would protect him. But time was working for his pursuers as well, wearing down the silence of men who had once promised never to talk. In the slow rhythm of prison life, years have a way of grinding down even the most stubborn promises. Burton Kaplan had entered custody insisting he would never betray certain secrets. He had lived his whole adult life balancing on thin lines between business and crime, between legal trade and hidden deals. He knew dangerous men, and they knew him. Among the things he kept locked away was the story of the two detectives who had once been his most unusual partners. He was in his 60s when the cell door closed behind him for the first time. The narcotics conviction he'd received in the late 1990 seconds meant he could spend the rest of his life under fluorescent lights and watchful eyes. At first, he held to the unwritten code: speak as little as possible, never name names unless there is no alternative. When federal agents probed, he gave them carefully measured information about drug routes, distribution networks, and some mob figures. He stopped short whenever the conversation came near the subject of police. Time did what it always does. His body aged. Health concerns crept in aches that never quite went away. Medical tests. The quiet fear that he might not live to see another summer as a free man. His family came to visit, their faces a little older each time. Grandchildren grew taller between visits. The thought of dying in custody, far from ordinary life, weighed more heavily. Prosecutors from the Eastern District of New York didn't forget him. They returned periodically, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. They knew from earlier intelligence that Kaplan had been close to Anthony Casso and had moved money for the Lucchese organization. They also knew Casso had once described paying 2 cops through him. They needed Kaplan to either confirm or knock down that claim. At first, he sidestepped. Then gradually, he began to talk. Sometime in the early 2000s, he made a choice that changed the course of several lives. Faced with the rough math of his sentence and his age, he agreed to cooperate fully. This time, fully meant he would no longer keep separate piles of secrets. The story that had sat at the back of his mind, the one about the detectives, would come out. In long debriefing sessions, he described how he had met Stephen Caracappa, the quiet investigator from the organized crime unit, and then Louis, the larger, more flamboyant Brooklyn detective. He explained that Caracappa had been the initial contact, a man who already had access to high-level intelligence files and was willing, for money, to share them with Casso through Kaplan. As trust grew, Louis was drawn into the arrangement as well, adding his own access and his own readiness to bend rules. Kaplan outlined the basic agreement. Regular payments in cash, delivered in person, in return for information and occasional special services. He said the detectives were on a kind of unofficial retainer for Casso, receiving a base amount each month and extra when they were asked for more dangerous tasks. He spelled out in calm detail how a name would travel from Casso to him, then from him to the detectives, then back again, accompanied by an address, a license plate number, or other useful data. He didn't stop at the general description. He walked agents through specific events. He talked about the abduction of James "Jimmy" Heidel, explaining that the detectives had used their shields to pull Heidel from his car, handing him off to men who served Casso. He recalled how they had tracked down the address of Anthony DeLappy after he fled to California, and how that information had later been used to locate him for an attack. He described the way the wrong Nicholas Guido had been identified by punching his name into a database and assuming the first match was the intended target. Kaplan's account lined up with what Casso had said years earlier, but with far greater precision. He could describe where he met the detectives, how much he paid, what kind of car they drove, and which bank branches or restaurants they favored for certain passes. He gave dates and amounts that could be checked against duty rosters, phone records, and old surveillance logs. For the first time, investigators had something more than rumors and the word of a mob underboss. They had a middleman willing to say that he personally handed cash to 2 sworn officers, knowing full well that the money came from a crime family and that the favors being bought could put people in danger. Agents began the slow, careful work of verification. They pulled records from archives, old NYPD schedules, assignment logs, precinct duty sheets. They checked whether Louis and his partner were actually on duty, or at least in the city, during the periods when Kaplan said he met them or when certain attacks took place. They examined telephone toll records, comparing calls from Kaplan's known numbers to lines associated with the detectives. They revisited unsolved or partially explained killings that matched Kaplan's timeline. What they found did not contradict him. On the contrary, the more they dug, the more his story fit. Duty records suggested that the detectives were available on the dates when Heidel disappeared and when Edward Lino was stopped on the highway. A handwritten note in an old file about Delapi mentioned police interest in him not long before he was located in California, even though no obvious New York case was active against him by then. Notes in organized crime intelligence folders showed that information about suspected informants or internal disputes inside the Lucchese family had, at times, circulated through units to which Caracappa and Louis had access. The pattern alone wasn't yet enough to indict, but alongside Kaplan's testimony it formed the backbone of a potential case. The Eastern District prosecutors now believed they could bring formal charges against the two retired detectives. Still, this would be no ordinary indictment. They would, in effect, be accusing former members of the NYPD of aiding a mob underboss in multiple acts of violence and sabotage of investigations. The evidence had to be solid. While that work continued quietly in New York, Louis was building a very different kind of trail in Las Vegas. The move west had given him a new environment and new business opportunities. Alongside his acting efforts, he got involved with ventures that promised large, fast returns. Federal agents later concluded that some of those ventures involved distributing illegal substances. According to government allegations, he joined an arrangement in which he helped provide a supply of methamphetamine in the Las Vegas area. The buyers he thought he was dealing with were, at one point, working with law enforcement. Conversations were recorded. In those taped meetings, he wasn't just discussing product and price. He also spoke, boastfully, about his past. The man who had written an autobiography and acted in crime films still loved to weave stories, and the audience in front of him, whom he believed were fellow criminals, encouraged that side of him. On tape, he bragged about having used his detective position in New York to do things for the mob that no ordinary officer would do. He puffed up his role, hinting that he had been involved in many more acts than anyone knew. The exact language varied, but the message came through clearly. He wanted his listeners to see him not just as a retired cop, but as someone who had long moved comfortably in both law enforcement and organized crime. Those recordings eventually made their way back to the same federal circles in Brooklyn that had been collecting evidence based on Kaplan's cooperation. To prosecutors there, the tapes were astonishing. Here was the man they had quietly been investigating for his alleged role in helping Casso, now in another state, apparently confirming in his own words that he had done criminal favors for organized crime figures while still wearing a badge. The Las Vegas drug case also provided something practical, a present-day criminal charge that could be joined with the older conduct in a single federal indictment. Instead of trying to explain to jurors why they were only now charging retired detectives for acts that had happened more than a decade earlier, prosecutors could present a broader picture, long-term misconduct stretching from New York in the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds to ongoing illegal activity in Nevada. By early 2005, the pieces had come together. A federal grand jury in the Eastern District of New York heard hours of testimony. From Kaplan, from agents, from analysts who had gone through the records. They were presented with the old killings and abductions linked to Casso's anger, the pattern of inside information flowing from NYPD files to mob hands, and the more recent drug dealings in Las Vegas. The names of the two retired detectives appeared again and again. The grand jury voted to charge. The indictment that emerged accused Louis and his former partner of racketeering, conspiracy, and a series of specific crimes tied to their alleged work for the Lucchese family. It described a pattern of conduct, accepting regular monthly payments, providing confidential law enforcement information, helping locate individuals whom they knew were being targeted, taking part in the illegal detention of at least one victim, and obstructing justice by shielding Casso from investigation. Additional counts related to the Las Vegas methamphetamine conspiracy, tying the past and present together. In March 2005, the operation to arrest them unfolded quietly in Nevada. Federal agents coordinated with local law enforcement, watching their routines, waiting for a moment when they could move in with minimal risk to bystanders. Louis, by then in his mid-50s, was living what looked like an ordinary suburban life. On the day agents knocked on his door, or, by some accounts, intercepted him on the road, he was suddenly transported from the sunlit streets of Las Vegas back into the same federal system he had once navigated as a New York detective. Booked, fingerprinted, placed in a holding facility, he now faced the Justice Department not as a witness or case officer, but as a defendant. At a preliminary hearing in Nevada, prosecutors outlined just enough of the charges to argue that he should not be released easily. They described the seriousness of the racketeering allegations and his alleged history of working with organized crime figures. Defense attorneys countered that he was a retired officer with community ties, a man whose supposed misdeeds were dated and largely based on the word of convicted criminals. After arguments, a judge granted bail under strict conditions. A large bond, restrictions on travel, and orders to surrender his passport. For the moment, he remained free, but under a cloud that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. His name appeared in national headlines. News outlets across the country picked up on the story. Ex-NIPD detectives charged in mob killings. Former officer accused of working for crime family. Many reports used a now familiar phrase that summed up the prosecutor's theory. Mafia cops. Louis denied everything. Through his lawyers and in hallway comments to reporters, he insisted the accusations were lies spun by felons, seeking to reduce their own time behind bars. He pointed again to his earlier acquittals, arguing that he had been targeted for decades by people in government who never accepted that a man from his background could be innocent. He claimed that his prison informants were inventing or exaggerating stories to please prosecutors. He also leaned on his public image. Supporters pointed out that he had once been honored as one of the most productive detectives in Brooklyn, that he had written about resisting influence from his mob relatives, that he had even portrayed a mob character in a famous movie precisely because he understood that world as an outsider. The idea that this same man had, in reality, been a paid helper of a violent underboss struck some as too outlandish to be true. Yet the case that now formed against him was different from the ones he had beaten before. It did not rely on a single leaked document or one contested drug transaction. It combined multiple strands. The long, detailed account of Burton Kaplan, corroborating evidence from old files, statements from former Lucchese members who had chosen to cooperate, and the Nevada recordings in which Louis bragged about doing favors for organized crime while serving as a detective. He was ordered to travel to New York to face trial in federal court in Brooklyn, within sight of some of the same neighborhoods where he had grown up, joined the police department, and first crossed paths with the men who would later appear in his indictment. For the city, the case promised to be one of the most uncomfortable examinations of police conduct in its modern history. For Louis, it meant something more personal. At last, in a public courtroom, with jurors and cameras watching, people would line up to tell their versions of his life, versions that clashed violently with the heroic figure he had spent decades presenting on television, in print, and in conversation. The boy from a Brooklyn stoop who had once dreamed of respect was now walking back into the city under escort, his legacy and his freedom at stake, about to hear in open court every whispered suspicion and buried act that time had failed to erase. The plane dipped toward New York, and out of the small window, Louis could see the skyline that had once meant everything to him. Towers, bridges, the thin ribbon of the East River. Years earlier, he had driven these streets with a detective's shield in his pocket, feeling like he owned a piece of the city. Now marshals sat on either side of him, watching every movement. His wrists were cuffed, linked by a chain to the belt around his waist. They brought him to the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, a building he knew well from his old life. He had stood in its hallways as an investigator, waiting to testify, chatting with prosecutors. This time he entered through a different door, past holding cells and security checkpoints, and into a courtroom where his name sat on the wrong side of the caption, United States v. Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. At arraignment, he stood before the judge and listened as the clerk read out the charges. Racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, multiple killings tied to the Lucchese family, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, distribution of narcotics, and tax charges. The indictment laid out a pattern stretching from the mid-1980s in Brooklyn to the early 2000s in Las Vegas, saying that he and his former partner had been part of a criminal enterprise that included a major mafia organization. He answered in a firm voice, not guilty. His lawyers, seasoned defense attorneys used to high-profile organized crime cases, filed motion after motion. They argued that the charges were too old, barred by statutes of limitation. They said the government had built its case on the words of criminals desperately trying to shorten their own sentences. They attacked the reliability of Anthony Casso, of Al Darko, of Peter Chiodo, and even more sharply, of Burton Kaplan, whose new cooperation had unlocked the indictment. Prosecutors responded that this was not some stale, forgotten matter. They said the crimes were part of a single continuing pattern, that money from Casso had flowed to the detectives for years, and that the agreement to provide help had never really ended until Casso's arrest broke it. They pointed to the Las Vegas narcotics conspiracy as evidence that Louis' willingness to blend law enforcement knowledge with criminal deals had extended well into the 2000s. The judge ruled that the case would go to trial. The question of timing would be left, at least for the moment, to the jury and to later legal argument. Louis' bail arrangement from Nevada did not survive long once he was in Brooklyn. With the full picture of the charges now on display, and with prosecutors warning that he faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison if convicted, the judge decided that the risk of flight was too high. His bond was revoked. He would wait for trial in federal custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center, not far from the courthouse. From his cell, he could sometimes glimpse the same skyline he had watched from the plane. He passed the days meeting with his lawyers, reviewing transcripts, and reading through pages of discovery. Old reports, wiretap summaries, lab analyses, witness statements. He circled names, argued over dates, insisted that some witnesses were lying outright and that others were twisting ordinary police work into something sinister. Jury selection began in early 2006. Groups of citizens filed into the courtroom and answered questions from both sides. Could they be fair to a former officer? Could they evaluate testimony from admitted mob members and drug traffickers without bias? Some said they had grown up admiring the police and doubted they could ever believe claims that detectives had switched sides. Others said they distrusted law enforcement and might lean too far in the opposite direction. Those with strong feelings were excused. Eventually, 12 jurors and several alternates were sworn in. They came from various backgrounds: office workers, retirees, a teacher, a construction foreman. For the next several weeks, they would listen to a story about the city they lived in that few of them had ever imagined. The prosecutors began with a clear theme: betrayal. In opening statements, they told the jurors that evidence would show how two highly placed detectives had secretly agreed to help a mafia underboss, using their access to identify informants, track rivals, and even remove a young man from the street so that others could harm him. They walked the jury through the names of the dead: Heidel, Delapi, Lino, the wrong Nicholas Guido, and said each had a connection to the shadow arrangement between the detectives and Casso. Louis' defense team countered with a different story. They described him as a tough but honest cop who had grown up in a mob-linked family and spent his career fighting organized crime, not serving it. They said the government's key witnesses would be men who had already admitted to far worse actions than anything he was accused of. Those witnesses, they argued, were lying to save themselves and had seized on his name because it was already notorious from earlier accusations and his public persona. The government's first major insider witness was Alphonse "Little Al" Darko, the former acting boss of the Lucchese family. In calm, measured tones, he described the structure of the organization, how decisions were made, and how Casso had bragged about having cops on his side. Darko didn't claim to have handed any money to the detectives himself, but he said it was understood among some leaders that Casso had law enforcement connections who warned him about investigations and helped identify suspected traitors. Next came Peter Chiodo, the captain who had survived an attempt on his life and later chosen to cooperate. He told the jury about the day he was attacked and how, afterward, relatives who had never been involved in crime suddenly became targets. The only way those relatives' addresses could have been known, he said, was if someone with access to official records had provided them. He spoke of his fear when he realized that information meant to be safe in government files had apparently found its way into the hands of his enemies. Those early witnesses set the stage. The one who truly transformed the case, though, was Burton Kaplan. When he took the stand, he looked less like the energetic dealer he had once been, and more like an aging businessman worn down by years inside. For days, he answered questions from prosecutors, gradually laying out the history of his dealings with Caracappa and Louis. He described first meeting the quiet detective from the organized crime unit, how discussion of help had started small a plate here, a name there before growing into a formal paying arrangement. He explained how Louis had been brought in later, adding his own connection, his own access. Kaplan talked about monthly payments, usually around $4,000 apiece, handed over in cash. He recalled the locations: parking lots, diners, side streets in Brooklyn. Then he turned to specifics. He spoke in detail about James "Jimmy" Heidel. He said that Casso wanted Heidel apprehended. According to Kaplan, the detectives agreed to pick him up. He described being told afterward that they had stopped Heidel's car, removed him, and delivered him to men loyal to Casso. Heidel was never officially booked. His name did not appear in any public arrest records. To Kaplan, that silence said everything. He told the jurors about Anthony DeLappie's move to California, about how the detectives had used government systems to pull up his new life, passing that information back so that Casso's shooters could find him. Kaplan recounted a phone call afterward, in which Casso had praised the cops for their work. He talked about how the wrong Nicholas Guido had been found. A name passed from Casso, a request for an address, and then a search. Kaplan said he relayed the result from the detectives, believing it to be correct. Only later did he grasp that a young man, completely unconnected to Casso's world, had been mistakenly targeted. Defense attorneys cross-examined him aggressively. They highlighted his long criminal record, his initial refusal to cooperate, and the sentence reduction he was seeking by testifying. They suggested that he had read about the killings in newspapers and shaped his story to match what the government wanted to hear. They pressed him on small discrepancies in dates and amounts, trying to catch him in outright contradictions. Kaplan did not pretend to be a saint. He acknowledged his crimes plainly and admitted that he hoped to see his sentence cut. But he stuck to the core of his account. He described car models, restaurant layouts, even the way one of the detectives liked to sit in a booth with his back to the wall. Much of what he said could be, and was, checked against old records, and again, the broad strokes matched. Alongside the insider witnesses, agents and analysts took the stand to provide the paper backbone. They showed phone logs linking Kaplan and the detectives during key periods. They introduced duty rosters placing Louis and his partner on shift when certain events occurred. They walked the jury through charts, showing how information about specific targets appeared to flow from confidential files to the streets just before those targets were attacked. The Nevada recordings also entered the case. Jurors heard excerpts in which Louis spoke to supposed criminal associates about his past. On the tapes, he portrayed himself as someone who had long walked both sides of the line, hinting that he had done serious favors for organized crime figures while still a detective, and that he had access others did not. The defense said he was exaggerating, playing the tough guy to impress new partners. Prosecutors said his words revealed his true sense of pride in what he had done. Louis did not take the stand. Whether that was his choice or a decision made after consultation with counsel, only those in the defense room know. The result, though, was that jurors never heard him personally explain his version of events under oath. Instead, they had his book, old interviews, the Nevada tapes, and his lawyer's arguments to represent his side. In closing arguments, prosecutors returned to the image of the badge. They told jurors that the shield issued by the city was meant to protect people, not to hunt them for the benefit of a mafia group. They said that each witness from Darko and Chiodo to Kaplan had added a layer to the story, and that the official documents and recordings had filled in the blanks. They asked the jury to see not just individual crimes, but a long-running agreement in which two detectives sold their access and their authority. Defense counsel urged the jury to resist what they called a sensational narrative pushed by cooperating criminals. They compared the witnesses to actors reading from a script written by federal agents. They reminded jurors that Casso, the original source of the mafia cop's claim, was so untrustworthy that the government had once torn up his cooperation deal. They said no honest system should hinge the fate of former officers on the word of men who had done far worse than anything in the indictment. The jury retired to deliberate. Outside, reporters waited on the courthouse steps. Families of victims sat in corridors, talking quietly. Law enforcement veterans watched from a distance, some hoping for acquittal, others quietly believing that long-held suspicions were finally being tested. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors sifted through evidence. Transcripts, charts, tape excerpts, jury instructions. They worked for several days. On the 6th of April 2006, they sent word that they had reached a verdict. Everyone filed back into the courtroom. Louis sat at the defense table in a suit, heavier than he had been in his detective days. His expression carefully controlled. His former partner sat beside him. The clerk read out the verdicts, count by count. Guilty on racketeering. Guilty on racketeering conspiracy. Guilty on charges tied to the killings of Anthony DeLappy, James Hydell, Edward Leno, and the mistaken Nicholas Guido, among others. Guilty on the Las Vegas narcotics conspiracy. Guilty on the tax-related counts. Louis stared straight ahead. Family members behind him cried. Some relatives of the victims let out quiet breaths they had been holding for years. The judge ordered the defendants taken into custody immediately. Whatever life Louis had built in Las Vegas was now out of reach. He was back in federal detention, this time with the weight of multiple convictions on his shoulders and the prospect of a life sentence hanging over him. For a brief moment after the verdict, though, there was an unexpected twist. In the months that followed, the judge took up the defense's argument about timing. After reviewing the law on racketeering limitations and how old conduct could be charged, he concluded that the core racketeering counts might be barred by time. In 2006, he issued a ruling setting aside parts of the jury's verdict on that basis and ordering a new trial on some pieces. Louis saw a narrow path of hope. If the racketeering structure collapsed, some of the related counts might fall with it. The government appealed the judge's ruling to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, saying the verdict should stand exactly as the jury had delivered it. In 2008, the appeals court issued its decision. It reversed the judge's move to set aside the verdict, holding that the racketeering charges had been properly brought and that the jury's findings should be respected. The convictions were fully reinstated. Any faint legal opening created by the limitations argument closed. Sentencing followed. In early 2009, Louis and his former partner returned to the Brooklyn courtroom for what would likely be their last major appearance there. Victims' relatives spoke about years of confusion and grief, about the shock of learning that officers sworn to protect them had, according to the jury's findings, played roles in the deaths of loved ones. Some law enforcement officials told the court how deeply the case had cut into public trust. Louis addressed the judge. He insisted he was innocent, said he had never killed anyone for the mob, said he was being punished for the sins of others, and for a reputation he had carried all his life. He spoke of his family, of his years on the job, of the commendations he had earned. He said the government's witnesses were liars who had traded stories for lighter sentences. The judge listened, then delivered his own view. He described the detective's actions, as found by the jury, as one of the most serious betrayals of public duty the court had ever seen. He spoke of how using police access to assist a violent criminal organization undermined faith in the entire system. Then he announced the penalty. Life in prison, plus additional years, effectively ensuring that Louis would spend the rest of his days in federal custody. Financial penalties and forfeiture orders followed, though the practical effect of those measures was limited compared to the weight of a life sentence. Appeals continued over the next several years. Lawyers challenged aspects of the trial, the use of certain testimony, and the way the racketeering law had been applied. The Second Circuit reviewed and upheld the conviction again. Higher courts declined to intervene. The legal avenues narrowed until only small, technical motions remained possible. By the end of that process, the story of Louis' courtroom battle had reached its final legal chapter. The boy from Brooklyn who had once dreamed only of a badge and respect, who had become a detective, an author, a minor film actor, and then a defendant in one of the most startling corruption cases in New York history, was no longer fighting for acquittal. He was instead facing the long, unchanging reality of a life term. He left New York once more, transported not as a retiree chasing opportunity, but as an inmate assigned to the federal prison system. The desert he had chosen years earlier as a place for his second act would soon play a very different role in his story. The bus rolled through the desert before dawn, its windows darkened, its passengers chained in rows. Louis sat near the middle, wrists cuffed, ankles shackled, a chain running up to the heavy belt at his waist. Outside, the landscape stretched flat and pale under a wide sky. Years earlier, he had driven this kind of highway in a rented car on his way to casinos and movie sets. Now he watched it behind scratched glass, headed not to Las Vegas but past it, deeper into federal custody. He was assigned to a high-security penitentiary in the Southwest, the kind of place where fences came in layers and towers watched every yard of open ground. As a former New York City detective, and a man convicted of helping a mafia underboss, he could not simply be dropped into the general population. Prison officials knew that some inmates had long memories, and that many had reasons to hate law enforcement of any kind. They placed him in a unit designed to keep certain prisoners apart. Former officers, people who had testified against dangerous groups, and others who could not safely mix with the main yard. Inside that unit, days fell into a narrow pattern. Count, meals, limited recreation, count again. The noises of prison life, doors slamming, keys turning, distant shouts became his background music. Even there, inside a wing meant to isolate, he was not anonymous. Word traveled fast in any institution. New arrivals were sized up by what the paperwork said and what rumors filled in. Guards knew his case from the headlines. Some inmates recognized his face from news reports or old crime documentaries. A few had met him years earlier, in holding cells and courtrooms in Brooklyn, when he wore a gun and they wore street clothes. To some prisoners, he was just another exu-cop, and that was enough to make him a target if given the chance. To others, the story that he had once been paid by a mafia underboss to locate rivals and suspected informants stirred a different kind of reaction. Some were disgusted. In their eyes, it was one thing to be a criminal, another to swear an oath and then cross over. A smaller number treated him warily as someone who had lived around power on both sides and might still know things worth listening to. Louis presented himself much as he always had. He told anyone willing to listen that he was innocent, that he had been framed by lying mobsters and drug dealers desperate to cut their own sentences. He said he had spent his entire life fighting organized crime and was now paying for other people's sins. He talked about his commendations, about being one of Brooklyn's most decorated detectives, about the earlier cases he had beaten in New York. When officers escorted him to the small recreation yard allotted to his unit, he moved more slowly than he had in his detective days. Age and health were catching up. Years of eating on the run and sitting long hours in cars had left their mark. He carried extra weight and suffered from chronic conditions that required regular medication. Prison doctors monitored his numbers, adjusting pills as needed. But there was no disguising that he was an aging man now facing a future measured not in decades of free time but in years behind wire. He filed appeals and motions, working with lawyers on the outside, and using whatever resources were available inside. He applied for a new trial, arguing that the testimony against him had been unreliable and that the law had been misapplied. He questioned the use of certain witnesses, attacked Burton Kaplan's credibility again, and raised technical objections about racketeering charges. One by one, those challenges were heard and rejected. Courts at the appellate level reviewed the record, pointed to the jury's verdict and the corroborating documents, and left the conviction standing. He complained frequently about his treatment. In letters to friends and family, and in legal filings, he said the government had it out for him, that prosecutors had twisted every ambiguous fact into proof of guilt. He claimed that books and television shows about his case had poisoned public opinion and made it impossible for him to get a fair hearing. He called journalists who wrote about him fiction writers, insisting that they had repeated lies without checking. Outside prison walls, the story of the mafia cops continued to echo. Reporters and authors pieced together their own accounts, drawing on trial transcripts, investigative files, and interviews with investigators who had spent years chasing leads. One major book, written by a former NYPD detective and a journalist, laid out in detail how internal suspicions about Louis and his partner had grown, how the leak of the wrong Nicholas Guido's address had floored honest officers, and how Burton Kaplan's eventual decision to talk had broken the case open. Documentary crews produced episodes for television, cutting between archival footage of crime scenes in 1,980 seconds Brooklyn and modern shots of the desert prison where Louis now lived. Former prosecutors appeared on screen, speaking about betrayal and the difficulty of proving corruption at such a high level. Relatives of the victims talked about holidays ruined, calls that never came, and their shock at learning that detectives had been accused of helping their enemies. Louis heard about these programs secondhand, through letters and occasional mentions by guards who had caught an episode on their own time. He hated them. In his view, each new documentary and article buried his version of events a little deeper. The heroic narrative he had once sold in his book of a cop who rose from a mob family to honor the law had been pushed aside by a darker portrait that he insisted was false. He also followed, through whatever fragments of news he could get, the fate of his old partner. Like Louis, Stephen Caracappa had been sent into federal custody to serve a life sentence. Because of health issues, Caracappa eventually transferred to a medical center within the prison system. In April 2017, word spread that he had died there in his mid-70s. For Louis, the news brought mixed reactions, though he rarely shared them openly. On one level, the death of the man who had been by his side through so much through years of detective work, through the trial, through the moment the verdict was read, was another reminder of time's weight. They had once been middle-aged cops walking confidently through squad rooms, confident they could out-talk and outthink anyone. Now one of them was gone, the other moving through his cell with the slow care of an older prisoner who knew how quickly a fall or sudden illness could change everything. On another level, Caracapa's death froze the story in a particular way. Two men had been convicted together based on largely the same body of evidence. One would never again speak in public or file a new motion. The other, Louis, remained the sole living person able to protest or reinterpret what the court had found. To some, that meant his continuing declarations of innocence deserved less weight. To others, it meant that if there were details no one had yet heard, they now rested with only one man. He stayed in touch with his family as best he could. His wife visited when possible, traveling long distances to reach the remote facility. Children and grandchildren came when schedules and money allowed. In visiting rooms, they sat at plastic tables under fluorescent lights, talking across a narrow space about birthdays, school events, and everyday troubles. Louis often steered the conversation back to his case, repeating his belief that one day the truth would come out, and that people would see he had been wronged. For his relatives, holding on to that belief was a way to protect him and themselves. Accepting the jury's version that a husband and father had secretly helped a violent underboss carry out attacks would have meant rewriting their own memories of him. It was easier in many ways to see him as the victim of an unfair system, especially when he looked them in the eye and insisted that he had never done what the court said he did. Occasionally, journalists tried to reach him for interviews. Some requests were denied by prison authorities. Others never got past his lawyers. A few written exchanges did occur. In letters quoted later, he struck the same notes he always had: that he had spent his life fighting crime, that his convictions were built on lies, that the government had used him as a symbol to send a message about corruption, regardless of the truth. He did not, in those letters, apologize to the families of the men whose deaths had been tied to his actions by the jury. From his point of view, there was nothing to apologize for. To those families, and to the investigators who had spent years assembling the case, that refusal was another injury. They pointed to the evidence, the duty logs, the phone records, the matching details in multiple witnesses' stories, and saw no room for doubt. Inside the prison, Louis tried to carve out a manageable routine. He read. He watched television in the common room during designated hours, careful about where he sat and with whom he spoke. He exercised as much as his health allowed, walking laps in the yard or along the short run of hallway when weather confined everyone indoors. He traded stories with other aging inmates about New York in earlier decades, though he often left out the parts others most wanted to hear about those lady-night meetings in diners, those quiet phone calls that had once moved information from police files to mob tables. He also watched from a distance, as the world he had known in New York continued to change. Many of the old bosses were gone, dead, or locked away. The traditional crime families had lost much of their open power, squeezed by sustained federal pressure and by changes in the city's economy. Younger officers now patrolled streets he would not have recognized, using technology that did not exist when he joined the force. For those officers, his case was a cautionary story told in academy ethics classes and corruption briefings, a lesson in how far someone could fall and how long it might take for that fall to be fully exposed. Former colleagues reacted to his imprisonment in different ways. Some who had worked alongside him in detective squads insisted privately that they had never seen any sign of the conduct the government described, and that they still found the verdict difficult to accept. Others admitted that, in hindsight, certain things made more sense. Unexplained knowledge of underworld movements, a tendency to show up in the orbit of major mob cases without a clear reason. Within the NYPD as an institution, the case drove home the need for stricter controls over access to sensitive databases and closer monitoring of who ran, what names, and when. New auditing systems were put in place. The idea that a detective could simply type a name into a computer out of curiosity and share whatever came up over coffee was no longer something supervisors looked past. Training emphasized that information was not just a tool but a kind of weapon, and that misuse of that weapon could carry consequences as severe as any street-level crime. From his cell, Louis occasionally heard about those changes, usually through letters or brief mentions in news stories. He sometimes framed them as proof that the department and prosecutors were trying to rewrite history, to make his case the central example of corruption when, in his mind, he had done nothing different from what many others did. He refused to see his situation as unique, even though the law and the evidence had treated it as exactly that. As the years passed, his health worsened. Age and illness did what no prosecutor or investigator ever could. They limited his movements, dulled his energy, shortened his days. He spent more time in the infirmary, more time waiting in medical lines, more time measuring his life not by the turning of legal pages but by the schedule of pill calls and checkups. Yet he held on to a certain stubborn pride. He did not admit guilt. He did not reconcile publicly with the picture prosecutors had drawn of him. He kept in his own mind the story of Louis the good detective, Louis the framed cop, Louis the man who had spent decades protecting a city that had now turned its back on him. That story, whether others believed it or not, gave shape to his remaining time. Outside, the world moved on. New scandals and trials captured headlines. Younger audiences learned his name not from fresh news, but from old documentary reruns and crime history programs. For many of them, he was not a living figure, but a symbol from a past era. A cautionary tale about what can happen when power and access are mixed with greed and divided loyalties. Behind the high fences and razor wire of the desert prison, though, he remained very real. An aging man walking slowly to meals, waiting for mail, remembering Brooklyn streets and NYPD squad rooms that existed now, mostly in his memory. The boy on the stoop, the brash detective, the media-savvy author, the defendant in shackles, all of those versions of himself came together in that cell. His story still had an ending to reach, and it would come not in a courtroom or on a movie screen, but in the quiet routines of the institution that now held what remained of his life. In his last years behind the walls, mornings started before dawn. A guard's flashlight would sweep across the tier, keys would jangle, and a voice would call for count. Louis would push himself up slowly on the thin mattress, joints protesting, wait while the officer checked his number, then ease back down until the lights came fully on. The prison where he spent those final seasons sat in dry country, ringed by fences and scrub. Summers were harsh, winters cold at night. From the rec yard, when he was allowed out, he could see low hills in the distance, and a sky so big it seemed to flatten everything beneath it. He had come west years earlier, chasing sun and movie work. Now the same sky hung over exercise yards and concrete blocks. Age and illness caught him piece by piece. He developed serious heart trouble and other chronic problems. Walking the short distance from his cell to the infirmary left him winded. Some days he shuffled instead of stepped. He took a string of medications, lining them up in the order prescribed. Nurses watched his blood pressure, his breathing, his weight. He complained about the food, about the lack of proper care, saying that the system was slowly killing him. Through his attorneys, he filed requests, asking to be released on compassionate grounds. He argued that his conditions were severe, that he had only limited time left, that he should be allowed to spend his remaining months at home with his family. Lawyers attached medical reports, letters from relatives, and arguments that he no longer posed any risk to public safety. Prosecutors opposed those requests. They pointed to the seriousness of his crimes as found by the jury, the number of people harmed, and the damage done to public trust. In their view, a life sentence imposed for such conduct should be carried out unless truly extraordinary circumstances arose. Judges who reviewed the petitions agreed with the government. His applications were denied. He would remain where he was. He did not accept that conclusion quietly. In conversations with anyone who would listen, he said the justice system had abandoned mercy when it came to him. He insisted that he had never done the things described at trial, that he was a sick old man being punished for a story built on the words of liars. He said other inmates who had committed brutal acts had gone home early for health reasons while he stayed, a retired detective who, in his telling, had only ever tried to do his job. Outside, the narrative had already settled into place. Books and investigative pieces treated the jury's findings as the factual outline of his life. One of the most widely read accounts, written by a former NYPD investigator and a reporter, told how internal suspicions about him and his partner had grown, how the wrong Nicholas Guido case had stunned honest officers, and how Burton Kaplan's slow, reluctant cooperation had finally provided the missing link. The book contrasted his own memoir titled Mafia Cop, in which he had called himself an honest officer from a mob family, with later evidence that he had, according to the courts, taken the opposite path. Television programs revisited his story on anniversaries, or in series about organized crime. Viewers saw grainy photos of him as a younger man on the force, then footage of him in handcuffs being led into court. The words, "Mafia Cop," splashed across screens. Prosecutors described how access to police computers and arrest powers became tools in the hands of a crime family. Relatives of Heidel, Delapi, Lino, and the innocent Nicholas Guido sat for interviews, speaking about calls that never came home and holidays forever changed. For the New York Police Department, his case became a constant reference point in training on ethics and corruption. In classrooms at the academy, instructors talked about database audits, supervision of sensitive units, and the need to keep personal associations clear of conflicts. They reminded recruits that one veteran detective's choices had stained the reputation of thousands of others who had never crossed a line. The message was simple: no one is above scrutiny, and betrayal from inside is often the most dangerous. In the neighborhoods where he had grown up, people aged alongside him. Old social clubs closed or became coffee shops. Some of the younger generation heard his name only as part of a fading legend, mentioned in passing when older residents talked about how different things were back then. For them, the idea that an NYPD detective could have helped a crime family was a story from another era, not something that touched their own lives directly. Friends and family continued to send letters. They wrote about ordinary things: children starting college, small business troubles, weddings, illnesses. The way the city skyline looked different each year. In his replies, Louis slipped between everyday chatter and long arguments about his case. He quoted from legal opinions he disliked, dissected witness statements, insisted that future historians would see through what he called a manufactured narrative. He also thought about his earlier career. In quiet hours, he replayed the commendations he had received, the arrests that had been praised, the times he had entered dangerous situations and come out with suspects in cuffs. Those memories mattered to him. They were proof, at least in his mind, that he had once done real police work, whatever others claimed about what had happened later. What he rarely mentioned, except to deny, were the scenes that prosecutors had painted: the lady-night stops, the quiet handing over of names and addresses, the flow of envelopes from Kaplan. He rejected that version of his life in full. There was no middle ground. Either he was the honest detective targeted because of his last name, or he was the traitor described in the indictment. He chose and clung to the first. Time has its own logic, though, separate from court filings and news reports. As the decade moved on, his body weakened further. In the prison medical unit, staff adjusted his treatments again and again, trying to manage complications. Fellow inmates saw less of him in the yard, and more of him moving carefully down the corridor, sometimes with assistance, sometimes alone but with one hand on the wall for balance. In November 2019, word broke outside the walls that he had died in federal custody at 71 years old. Officials said he passed from natural causes related to his health problems. There was no dramatic final statement, no last-minute confession or reversal, just another entry in the log of a prison infirmary. News article noted his passing in short bursts. They listed his birth in Brooklyn, his rise as a decorated detective, his book and brief movie roles, his conviction in 2006, his sentence of life plus additional years, and his death in a Western federal prison. Some pieces quoted investigators who said that, while his death closed a chapter, the damage his actions had done could not be undone. Others briefly mentioned his family's long-held belief that he had been wrongly convicted. For the families of the dead whose names had appeared at trial, the news landed differently. Some felt a measure of closure, knowing that both men the jury had found responsible would never again walk free. Others said it changed little. Their losses had happened decades earlier. No prison term, no obituary could restore what had been taken. Inside the NYPD, there was no official ceremony to mark his life's end. Departments do not hold funerals for officers whose badges have been stripped after major criminal verdicts. For many still on the job, his story remained less about him as an individual and more about the institution's vulnerability. His passing did not erase the need to stay watchful against similar betrayals. Looking back across the course of his life, the contrast is stark. He began as a Brooklyn kid in a family whispered about for its ties to organized crime. He grew up watching figures in suits and overcoats command respect on the sidewalk while patrol cars rolled past. He chose, at least outwardly, the path of the uniform, joining the New York City Police Department, working his way into detective squads, collecting medals and plaques. For a time, he embodied the image he wanted, the tough, streety smart cop who knew the underworld but was not part of it. He wrote a memoir built on that idea, calling himself the honest officer whose relatives had been on the wrong side. He went on national television to tell that story, and even stepped into a famous crime film to play, for a moment, the kind of man he said he'd never become. But according to the courts that later judged him, the line he'd long claimed to walk had been crossed years before. Jurors heard from former mob leaders, from a one-time Lucchese captain, from the middleman who paid him, and from agents who traced old records. They concluded that his badge and his access had been used not only to pursue criminals, but also to assist a violent underboss in protecting himself, tracking enemies, and silencing perceived traitors. He never accepted that conclusion. Until his final days, he repeated that he had been broken by false testimony and government ambition. The record, however, stayed where it was. Verdicts affirmed on appeal, sentences carried out, lessons drawn. What remains now is the shape of the story, rather than the arguments around it. A child of a mobbing-linked household enters law enforcement, rises inside it, then, if the evidence is accepted, secretly joins hands with the very world he is supposed to oppose. When his conduct is exposed, he falls not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of how deep corruption can cut when it reaches someone with a shield and a gun. There is also a quieter message in the arc of his life, a reminder of how powerful the desire for status and belonging can be. From the beginning, Louis wanted to be somebody. As a boy, he watched adults on both sides of the law and saw in each a kind of authority. Later, he sought that recognition as a detective, as an author, as a minor actor, telling and retelling tales in which he played the central part. In the end, he became widely known, but not in the way he once imagined. The name that appears in crime histories and law textbooks is attached not to a heroic figure, but to a cautionary one. For people who grew up in the city he once policed, his story now sits alongside others in a long, complicated history. A reminder that institutions rely on the integrity of individuals, that background and bravado can hide dangerous choices, and that truth about those choices can take years to fully surface. In a quiet cell in the desert on the nights before his health failed for good, he likely lay awake at times and traced earlier days in his mind. Summer air on Brooklyn streets, the feel of a fresh uniform, the weight of a detective's shield in his hand, the buzz of squad rooms, the flash of cameras when he first stepped in front of national audiences. Those memories, whatever their private color, belonged only to him. The public record that survives tells a harder story, one measured in court transcripts and legal opinions rather than in his own words. It is the story of a man who began life at the intersection of law and organized crime and, according to the judgment of a jury and the courts that reviewed the case, ended up crossing from one side to the other. That is where the tale of Louis Eppolito rests now. In the space between the image he spent years building and the version of events established by those who investigated and tried him, a permanent part of the larger history of New York, its police department, and the crime families that once shaped so much of its hidden life.